trusted the blacksmiths to doctor their horses, and they didn't know about these new upstarts. Well, Bracy Clark was both. He was a farrier and he was a veterinarian, an official veterinarian that they just started. So he wrote prolifically. So he didn't just write this one big book, Hippodonamia, which is the Hippodonamia or the true structure. I want you to think about that. Why is now he's in an age when the horse is everything. Okay. Why is he saying it like this? Hippodonamia or the true structure, the true structure. Because he found that these feet deform and that you would make judgments based on a deformed foot and think that that was, and so when you are looking at the anatomy and it's deformed, but you don't know it, at the same time, you're trying to determine how you're going to practice trimming and shoeing that horse to fit the anatomy. See, that's barefoot trimming. Jamie Jackson had an idea of that horses have no heels but a steep dorsal wall. And then he searched around till he finally found a couple wild horses that fit the bill, and he used those, which were deformed feet. He took deformed feet and he developed a whole industry of people trying to trim and practice on the foot to get the foot to conform to his ideal. And so just because he found one or two horses that fit the bill, just because a horse can deform its own feet, just like, your breasts can get old and fibrous as you age, doesn't mean that's what you're supposed to have. See? And so this is what the whole natural hoof care movement is based on, is a deformed foot. And so the trim is meant to deform the foot into that image that's been put in everybody's head. And so in his day, the problem was the false doctrine of frog pressure, where they were constantly lowering the heels, trying to get frog pressure. And what that does also is it contracts the heels. And one of the biggest problems they had with horses was contracted heels. So anyway, so his book, Hippodonamia, which he put these two Greek words together to nomia means law. Nomia means law. That just came to me. Okay. Hippo is horse. Okay. Nomia, podo, hippo. Okay, that's pretty cool. I'm just seeing this. Okay. Hippo is horse. Podo is foot, podiatry. And nomia means laws. That was cool. I'd never seen that before. Not like that. That was really cool. See, you got to realize that was cool for me because I studied Greek. I'm not good at Greek, but that's Greek to me and I understood it. Finally. That was awesome. You see, this is why I love hoof chats because I learn as I go. Okay, so I just realized how he put that together. That makes me want to cry. Or the true structure, laws. There are principles and laws. And guess what? You stick to them. The horse's foot is not some arbitrary thing you can just carve and form into whatever you think is right. Or you know better than those big lick suckers, right? The true structure, laws, and economy, I don't understand that word, of the horse's foot. I don't understand that part. Economy, I'm going to have to look that word up. By Bracy Clark. Now, he said this because he found out that what he had been led in his schooling to believe was true was not true. And so I found this interesting that before I ever heard of Bracy Clark, I was starting to see the same thing. That what the farriers were teaching was not true. What they taught about the soul wasn't true. What they taught about dressing down the wall was not true. Many, things like that. And so at one point, I did this series on YouTube called Understanding the True Foot of the Horse because I saw that there was something else going on here, that what they were teaching was not correct. And so then later I heard about Bracy Clark. And when I found this book and stuff and the name of this book where he says the true structure, laws, and economy of the horse's foot, now I understand why he was saying that. From what I read, but I see the similarities of what I was seeing and what he was seeing. Because if you look closely and you examine, you know, he started saying, well, yeah, we're doing this and they're telling us it's right, but these horses are going lame. I'm just doing it to my one horse. Well, yeah, I'm doing this, and I know wild horses do good out there, and this is what they say a wild horse foot like, but I'm doing this to my horse, and he doesn't like to run anymore, you know? So you open it up. Let's get up here. He had long titles, and you have to have long titles because it's a big subject. See? And so he had two names for the book. Hippodanomia. That's just so cool the way he put that word together. Oh God, I'm just thrilled. Anyway, the true structure, laws, and economy of the horse's foot. Also, podo. I don't even know if I can pronounce this. Podopathora. So we know we get the word podiatry from this Odo word, right? Okay, Greek, whatever. Okay, and that means he's put all these words together. I don't know which exact words those are. I'm going to have to look it up. But anyway, that means uh, a ruinous defect in the principle of the common shoe detected and demonstrated by experiments with he's taken this one word, different Greek words to put this one word together, and uh, it means all of this. See, so this is awesome. So I'm going to read it again. A ruinous defect in the principle of the common shoe detected and demonstrated by experiment with a proposition for a new principle of shoeing, which abundant practice has since confirmed. This is so awesome. All right, so this book he writes in he publishes in 1829. But he had done these experiments 20 years previous. Okay, he found out in 1809 what, see, this is a preface. If we were to go back right here, okay, right here, where is it? Okay, so here's Hippodanomia. Over here it says a series of original experiments on the foot of the living horse. When was that published? It was published in 1809. And it's got a lot of the same stuff in the preface of it. Um, but there's also some really different stuff in the preface. So if we get in here, this again, published in 1809, a series of original experiments. Nobody had ever done this before him. Why is he so important? He named the periopal, he named the frog stay, and he named the commissures. The commissures, that's those little valleys that run what we call the collateral grooves. Okay. He did many experiments, see, he did dissections, sure, but he experimented and he was taught originally he was taught the doctrine of frog pressure and he practiced it from the time he graduated, which was about 1893 on. Uh, by 1809, he had, okay, so he graduated in 1890 something. And then I'm going to read you the first paragraph here and the other one because he's got the same basic preface, except 20 years later, he's learned a whole bunch more that he was unaware of that he shares when he finally writes the book Hippodonamia. Okay, so he says about 7 years ago, whilst pursuing some experiments. So it's 1809. So that would make it what's that? 9 minus 7 is what? 2? 1802, 5, 6. Anyway, 1802, he came to this conclusion, and so he started doing experiments to see what was going on. And it was this: about 7 years ago, whilst pursuing some experiments on the contracted feet of horses, trying to decontract them. He wasn't the only one doing it. People did not understand why they were contracted. Guess who does? We do. We understand things that he never did, but was close to. If he would have had all the uh, cameras and pictures and everything that we got, he'd have figured it out too. Hey, when you trim the heels down, the foot wants to set back up where it's supposed to. And as it does, it pulls the heels around and contracts them and curls them in. That's it. That's it. And so he says about 7 years ago, while pursuing some experiments on the contracted feet of horses, it occurred to me that the cause usually advanced to explain this serious imperfection. So we're not real. So he was asking the horseshoers, the main horseshoers, because he was a vet, he had a shoeing establishment, but he's still asking all these horseshoers and stuff like that because they'd been in the business for several hundreds of years, right? So what is the cause of contracted heels? They ought to know, right? And uh, the fact was, he says, it occurred to me that the cause is usually advanced, given to me by farriers, to explain this serious imperfection. Okay, it's not just an imperfection. It's worse than that because it shortens the life and the use of the horse. And it makes them dangerous to ride because they like to stumble. It says, were not real. Means it was not true. Okay, now he's writing years later after he's done some experiments to prove this to be so. And so he says, where is it here? And that in fact, the accidents, okay, so you got all these horses, and this is continually happening. Accidents, the farriers have accidents on your horse. You could take your farrier to court and sue them back then because they were supposed to know better. Carelessness, idle habits, and wanton tricks of the farrier. They call them smiths. They're blacksmiths. Okay, but that's a farrier. Had very little concern in its production. In other words, people were not experimenting, they were not delving in to the real reasons for why these horses' feet were contracted. He says, the efficient cause began to appear to me to lie much deeper and to consist of the very method itself, by which the shoe is affixed to the foot. And he says to establish this opinion by unerring evidence of experiment seemed difficult, yet a plan for effecting this purpose suggested itself, and a subject exceedingly well fitted for its application soon offered. So, what happened was you could not find a horse back then past a couple years that had not been shod. They put those horses into service and use as soon as they could. And so he just happened to know someone that had a horse that agreed to let the horse run till they were 5 years old so that they could look at the foot and see it's a natural foot. It's a natural foot. This is what the foot is supposed to look like and get an idea of what the real foot was. Because again, what is the name of his book? Hippodonamia, the true, okay, whatever it was, the true foot of the horse, the true laws, economy, blah, blah, blah of the horse. Okay, so he explains in this book about those experiments he did in those early years. He talks about like just a minute, let me get this down here. This thing, what did I do? Oh, there we go. Um, he talks a lot about where is it here? Light severity. Well, I think you should just go read this. I don't want to read the whole thing, but the fact of the matter is that the horses were horribly, horribly abused. Horribly abused and in pain all the time. And he came to recognize it. Okay, so he writes this preface here, and I want to see something here. Okay, he ends it over here, 1809. The end of it is quite different. Just a second here. In this, he speaks glowingly of the current president or dean, whatever you want to, of the School of Veterinary Medicine, Edward Coleman. 20 years later, Bracy Clark finds out that Edward Coleman had been doing him dirt, had been maligning and defaming him for 20 years, and that's why none of his research ever went anywhere. Okay? So this preface, while being similar, is different in that, as I said, Bracy Clark was originally taught the frog pressure doctrine. So what he says in his preface in the second book, where he talks about the false doctrine of Lafosse, the false frog pressure doctrine, in the time from here to the time of 1828 or 9, when he wrote his main book, he found out that that doctrine was false. And so they started leaving heels on horses. So that remark he makes about Lafosse is not in this preface in 1809. See, I'm right at the end because, where is it here? He does not mention Lafosse here, right here. But if we go to the other book, okay, now remember, there's 20 years of research that he did. Well, how much experimentation and research can you do in that kind of environment? Horses are everywhere. He had 2 or 3 shoeing establishments in London. And you could get all the cadavers he wanted. And he did many, many dissections trying to figure these feet out. Okay, so same. Okay, now this is 20 years later. And I want you to see the preface, how it starts the same. I think he should have wrote 27 years ago, but he didn't. He says about 7 years ago, while pursuing some experiments on contracted feet of horses, it occurred to me that the causes usually advanced to explain this serious imperfection were not real, and that in fact the accidents, careless idle habits and wanton tricks of the smith, so much inveighed against, had very little concern in its production. The efficient cause began to appear to me lie much deeper, and to consist of the very method itself by which the shoe is affixed to the foot. And then again, to establish this opinion by unerring evidence and experiment seemed difficult, yet a plan for effecting this purpose shortly after suggested itself. So they get this horse, they let this horse just be basically in the pasture for 5 years and let its feet do whatever feet do so that they can figure out what is the natural foot and what the true foot and good foot of the horse is supposed to be. And then they're going to start shoeing her with the principles of the time to see what the foot's going to do. And to be able to do this, first they're going to take a plaster cast of her foot. See how great we got it? We just take pictures. Okay, they're going to take a plaster cast of her foot, and then they're going to take another plaster cast of her foot every time she's shod, so that they will have an exact replica, so that they can look at all these plaster castings and see how the foot changed over time. So he's going to show what he thinks the true foot of the horse is in this horse that was never shod. And then he's going to show how her feet were destroyed by the method of current trimming, is what he's going to do. As well, he's trying to he's coming up with different ways of uh, uh, dealing with the feet to try and keep this deformation from happening. And over time, he came to understand that that lowering the heels was wrong, and that this was the cause of contracted heels. And so in this, first of all, he goes on and on about Professor Coleman, what a lowlife he was. He says it in much fancier words though. Okay. But in the end of his uh gosh, preface, okay, in the end of his preface, he mentions Lafosse. He didn't in the other one. This is 20 years later. Okay. He says this, and as to Lafosse, if anyone will read him attentively and altogether, they will, I think, come to the conclusion that so far from borrowing from him. Now, the reason he's saying that is because Coleman was saying, oh, he ain't come up with nothing new. He's just following the boss. He's just taking ideas from so and so. That's what Coleman was doing. He was maligning him in this college constantly so that no one would take him seriously. He says they will, I think, come to the conclusion that so far from borrowing from him, I have allowed him to know what he never really understood. See, Lafosse never really understood the foot of the horse. But Bracy Clark came to some amazing, fabulous understandings and correction of the beliefs on the anatomy. And through all this time experiment, he was singularly obsessed with this subject. I don't even think he ever married. Yeah, he was wholly given to this. It says, and he says this. He says, or why did not his countrymen understand it before I published it? If I just borrowed from Lafosse's writings, then why didn't the French understand it, since they have Lafosse's writings and he's a Frenchman? Okay. And now they have my book and they understand it for the first time. So, he's defending himself from all this maligned verbiage that Coleman spewed out his mouth. So when you're the head of a school, you have quite an influence. See, and he was the head of that college. Edward Coleman was the head of that college that Gracie graduated from for 40 some years. And he established false doctrine about the foot of the horse in the veterinary profession and in the farrier professions that they still have up to this day. So it says, uh, Okay. Or why did not his countrymen understand it before I published and have practiced shoeing with the motion for the foot long ago? Remember, he wrote that other book clear back in 1809 about his experiments. But it was the business of these colleges formerly to depreciate Lafosse till I praised him as making the only step that had been made, though a false one. For certain it is that by, get this, his false doctrine about frog pressure, he did a great deal of harm, and the effects of it are still felt by thousands of men and horses, both in England and France at this day. Well, if there was thousands then, it's a million now, right? That doctrine is alive and well in the barefoot movement. In fact, the barefoot movement made it worse. Okay. They made it 10 times worse. What should have been a light, okay, wound up just bringing us into greater darkness. So it's interesting what he says, the difference in these two prefaces and what happened to him in that 20 years. And I was going to show you something interesting about something that happened to me recently, where he talks about here about 7 years ago, whilst pursuing some experiments on contracted feet of horses, it occurred to me that the causes advanced to explain the serious imperfection were not real. I gotta show you something. I'm going to show you where a farrier did the same thing to me just today. All right. Let me find it here. Unless they threw me off their page. Okay. So do you see this foot here? Can everybody see that? If anybody's left, I didn't bore everybody and
Yes,
put
it's
you to
here.
sleep.
We're here.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So, all right. So I seen this, and it's the Bluegrass Horseshoeing School. And he says, how radical have you gotten with shoeing in order to try and achieve a level comfort for the horse? Look at what they had to add to that horse's foot to get his foot up off the ground. And so, anyway, so I commented on that, and I also okay. So I said, Darren Griffith, to me, radical was what got the horse there to begin with, not what you had to do to help him. You understand what I'm saying there? I'm
Good
saying,
one.
okay, yeah. And so, of course, he's a farrier. They never understand a word you say anyway. All right. God forbid, don't compliment them. All right. Because then when you compliment them, they're going to figure out a way to turn it into an insult. It's just the way they are. They're just ornery. So he says to me, because he obviously didn't understand what I was saying, he says, well, Dan was there and I was there after him. Strange, I didn't see you there. Like, where the frick did that even come from? You know what I mean? Like, dude, what is with you? Okay, so I write back to him. You misunderstand. I was referring to, I guess he thought I was dissing him or something. He said, I was referring to all the hoof care trims that the horse received that led his foot to be like this. You and I, we know what happened to this horse. Frog pressure doctrine, trimming the heels out, taking the heels back, you know, forcing frog pressure. Says, I said, you misunderstand. I was referring to all the hoof care slash trims that the horse received that led his foot to be like this to begin with. I admire the job done here and was not dissing it. And here we go. Okay, so I told you that Bracy Clark says, it occurred to me that the reason put forth for why these horses have contracted heels was not real. Not true. Okay, the reason these experts are giving me is not true. And so it says, he says to me, he says, Linda Harris, I'm not sure about the horse's past care, but I will say, here we go. Many domesticated horses have genetic predispositions for chronic